Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film. Having watched The Crossing, we're going to take a moment to look at some of the important details and a few of the inaccuracies in the video worksheet. Now, question 3 has General Washington telling Alexander Hamilton to spike a cannon. Now, what this involved was taking a spike, ideally a metal one, and hammering that into the touch hole of the cannon and breaking the end of the spike off. That would make it impossible to use the cannon without at least drilling out the spike, and it's quite possible spiking it would damage the touch hole too badly to use the cannon safely. A cannon with a crack in it might explode when you lit it off. And it was pretty common to spike a cannon if you knew you had to abandon it somewhere where the enemy might capture it. Number 12 and also number 19 both mention General Charles Lee. He was a former British officer with extensive military experience in Europe and North America who was initially viewed as a very promising officer and who resented that Washington, who had never served in the actual British Army, had been placed in command over him. And somewhat like General Gates. But Lee was in a trickier position. He had not officially resigned from the British Army until he had already joined the Continental Army, and so, if captured, was eligible for execution as a deserter. And so, while he was a prisoner of the British, probably to save his own life, he helped General Howe plan military operations against the United States. He was released during a prisoner exchange in 1778. He fought poorly at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey, ordering a retreat when he'd been ordered to attack, and Washington chewed him out on the battlefield. Lee responded rudely and was arrested and court-martialed. He spent the rest of his life criticizing Washington until dying of a fever while visiting Philadelphia in 1782. Course number 13, and many other questions deal with General Horatio Gates, a former officer in the British Army, a background that made him feel superior to American officers, including George Washington. As I mentioned earlier, some members of Congress felt the same, and Gates would be part of a plot to replace Washington with himself as commander of the Continental Army. But he would go on to fight important battles in the North and in the South. Number 15, of course, refers to the fact that many members of the Army enlisted for a limited period of time, ranging from 3 months to a year, and many of those enlistments were due to expire at the end of 1776. General Howe is true. Number 16 is true. General Howe was having an affair with Elizabeth Loring, the wife of a prominent loyalist in New York City. And Mr. Loring was apparently quite aware of this, but didn't complain because he got a good paying job supervising prisoners, many of whom ended up held in rotting, unsanitary ships in New York Harbor. Howe was accused by many people of ignoring his military duties to spend time with Mrs. Loring. Number 22 shows us Colonel Glover making a point of being a plain man. Most upper-class men wearing wigs is a status symbol and is part of the style of the day, although George Washington also made a point of not wearing a powdered wig, partly to present himself as a man of the people, despite the fact that he was quite possibly the richest man in America, at least by the time he became president. Number 25, of course, is Washington's hope to attack the Hessians on Christmas Eve. But in fact, evidence shows they probably weren't really drunk. They were probably sober at the time of the attack, although dazed and tired from being woken up unexpectedly by an early morning attack, but probably not hungover. They were Germans and they loved Christmas and they loved drinking, but they were professionals too. Number 30 is spoken by the character Captain Heinemann, who is probably a fictional character, but does highlight the fact that there were many people of German ancestry in the United States, especially in Pennsylvania, where he is supposed to be from. Indeed, German was a very important language in the United States until the First World War. The number of German speakers in America was so large that there was discussion early in our history of publishing all laws in both English and German. There's even a legend that there was a plan to make German the official language of America, and that plan failed by just one vote. A story that sometimes appears as part of a series of saying why your vote matters. In fact, there was no plan to replace English with a different official language. It was always assumed English would be our primary language, but perhaps publishing things in a second language would make sense if a lot of people spoke it. Number 31 may be possible. People smoke all kinds of things when they can't find tobacco, including dried cow dung, which is not healthy, as you can imagine, although some people claim it is hallucinogenic. I'm not encouraging you to try. Number 32 is true. There were cakes of ice, icebergs in the Delaware River that were a real danger to Washington's men. And the blizzard was a whiteout, making it almost impossible for his men to see on the march to Trenton, but also kept the Hessians from seeing his men. 35 might be true. Colonel Glover may have insulted Knox for being fat. Knox certainly was a big man. He weighed around 300 pounds. Although he was about 6'3", about as tall as Washington himself, so very tall for the time period and probably carried the weight better than some. But he was still a fat man, and when Washington is later depicted as teasing Knox about his weight, that is apparently based on actual events. He apparently made a joke about Knox swamping the boat, or possibly sinking it because of his weight. We don't know the exact words, but he apparently really did that to ease the tension. Number 40 is not true. Alexander Hamilton was not sent on a mission to silence the guards or kill the sentries in their guardhouse. And he did play an important role in the battle with his cannons firing down the road in Trenton, but he was not a secret assassin ahead of the main battle. Verse number 44, Colonel Rahl hopes his men can keep their money. And the fact is, looting was very common. In European warfare and Indian warfare, mercenaries and Indian warriors often went to war for the hope of looting and pillaging their defeated foes. But the Hessians wouldn't suffer that indignity here. Number 47 is not accurate. The movie claims none of Washington's men were killed or wounded, and he was not quite that lucky, although pretty close. In fact, 2 men were killed and 5 wounded, including future President James Monroe. But that was a remarkably small casualty rate. Again, not much later. Many more men died from frostbite and hypothermia, starvation and illness. And in describing the aftermath of the war for several of the prominent characters, of course, 49 is true. Washington became our first president, inaugurated in 1789, elected in 1788. Number 50 is true. Alexander Hamilton became the first Secretary of the Treasury and died as a result of a wound suffered in a duel with the Vice President of the day, Aaron Burr, in 1804. And number 51 is true as well. Henry Knox was our first Secretary of War, a role later merged with the Secretary of Navy to become the Secretary of Defense, but not a joint role till 1947. And in general, the information presented at the end of the movie is true, although it says that General Mercer died 9 days later at the Battle of Princeton, where he was shot. In fact, he wasn't shot, but was stabbed with a bayonet and died of that wound. But a pretty minor point. And what's overall a pretty accurate and I think enjoyable movie.